you may not know the answers to some of these questions. So Rand said in this essay, Causality versus Duty, Rand was saying that Kant's genius was his capacity to sense, play on, and perpetuate human fears and irrationalities and ignorance. Do you know what you meant by?
No, not really that. No.
Yeah, okay. And then, so in the same essay, she talks about the concept of Kantian duty is inculcated when you tell a child you must do something because you must. I don't know if I've heard that expression before. I have heard do it because I say so or because God says so. Is that, do you think that's similar? Like it ends up being the same thing?
I think it's very similar. Yeah, I don't know if there's much of a difference.
Okay. The similarity is that there's some external factor that's irrelevant to your life and values that you must obey, right?
Yeah, just this, whatever it might be outside of the individual, is just the rule says so because you have to, because you're supposed to, not because it's good for you, but because you have to.
And then this may be trickier. So Rand compares a disciple of causation and a Kantian in pursuit of goals. She says, this is just summarized from the essay, she says that a Kantian does not focus on his goal, but on his own moral character, and that his automatic reaction is guilt and fear of failing his duty, showing weakness, which his duty forbids, or being morally unworthy. The result is that he seldom undertakes important goals. I'm having trouble, like when she wrote that, I was thinking, I'm having trouble picturing this because is this some kind of perfect Kantian being here, which couldn't really exist anyway, right? Or is this how it influences people day to day to the extent that they accept Kantian morality? I couldn't think of what is it, what's this person who does not focus on his own goal because of guilt and fear or failing his duty and showing weakness, which duty forbids. I was having trouble connecting that to reality.
I mean, do you remember the context that she brought that up specifically?
Well, I should be able to even find it. Here we go. Wait, is this it? That was just another example, I think. Yeah, here we go. This black section that I highlighted here.
What's before that?
Well, I don't think I. Oh. Yeah, I don't have it here. I just copy pasted it.
I'm thinking more in the sense of the one who believes in it, like not just like implicitly, but just somebody who understands what Kantianism is and trying to live by it. That's how I understand it to be. Then, or at least attempting to live by it. It seems to me that's what she's talking about, where if you attempt to do so, the average person would be fear of failing their duty, or that would be your motivation. The fear motivation seems to be what she's talking about here, like fear of weakness, fear of committing what the duty forbids.
Maybe I need to study Kant to understand this because I just don't get it. But maybe that's
I wouldn't,
the disconnect here.
I'm not interpreting it so much as what Kant specifically said, as much as what is duty bound morality supposed to be like. What does Rand say it does? I think she's making that claim because it's not about goals. Goals aren't part of a duty bound morality. It's not, goals aren't what determines what, isn't how you determine what is right or wrong. It's by some other standard.
Okay.
It's not action. It's divorced from action or goals for you as an entity.
Okay, let's I think I still think I need more philosophical knowledge because I don't have enough clear knowledge of what Kant's philosophy looks like.
Yeah, I would get something basic to read about the categorical imperative. I'm sure you could find something online. I think that would be the easiest way to get an idea of what Kant is uniquely speaking, as opposed to say just a Christian morality or something.
Right.
I would look at that.
So this is these are questions that I had in relation to that second lecture on the art of thinking. And so I think we discussed a little bit of integration, but it seems like there's integration is used in a very broad sense. So it may even include multiple concepts. Like you can take sensations to percepts are considered integration, percepts to concepts. But then, and then concepts to abstractions, it's kind of integration. Into principles is a kind of integration.
Yeah.
And then in a lecture, he said, if you're in a plane and there's all these chairs on the ground and you go up and you look at the chairs down 5 kilometers above and they're all together in one blur, that's not an integration. Which I thought about that in relation to sensation to percepts. Isn't that similar though? It's simply certain data is being combined and you're viewing it as one patch. Like compared to sensation versus percepts, I don't see why that's any different. If you want to go with that really broad umbrella definition of integration.
So you took it on the perceptual level, right?
Yeah, on the perceptual, just on the, we'll get to, yeah, just on the perceptual level, like why isn't seeing, if sensations into percepts are a form of integration and you're taking all this data and combining it, I think that's what's combining it into one picture, one image. Why wouldn't the chairs as a blurred patch be like a kind of integration on the sensational level?
I'm trying to think of a way to conceptualize that. So you might think of sensation just more. I think Rand is usually talking about something like there's like you get individually trying to think, but you could think of it. There's things in reality about objects that your brain makes into a perceptual whole. Right. In a sense, you call that integration in the way that there's a lot of information being taken in through whatever means that is. Yeah. And then that's put into a form that's graspable or perceivable as a whole, whatever process that might be. So you see things as a whole. I think Peacock might be saying that you wouldn't call that integration because it's not making something sensible or understandable. I would actually disagree. I would say it is integrated in some sense, as in, it's a blur, like as distinct from other blurs, something like that. I think that could be fair. You could say it's not much information. You could say it's not very clear, but you're still distinguishing it from probably another blur, I would imagine.
Right. But they're almost, when we talk about a conceptual or perceptual integration, they're almost completely different things, right? Like it's not even the same.
Yes.
I don't even know if it'd be the same definition.
I would agree.
What your mind is doing.
You're just putting information together is how I understand integration to be. But that, yeah, you're right. It would be very different.
If you say that, if you use the definition, making a whole from parts, then you can include, what else? Analogies are included, which I don't know, maybe that is a kind of integration. Comparisons are included.
Well, I'd be careful about saying wholes from parts, because we're not necessarily saying these things are parts. Rather, we're saying the information is integrated. It's not like you're taking some Legos and building something. It's not, you wouldn't think of it like that. Okay. I would think of it more like the information, whatever it is put into into a whole form, into a perceptual whole. Like in the way you see an individual ball or you see a tree, you see it as a whole. And that's what I'm trying to say is that information's there. It doesn't mean you've assembled parts. But the reason I was saying be careful of that, because you don't want to say that everything is just simply putting atoms together, but you want to think of it as a whole is being created, not out of pieces, but as much as information is put together.
Right. I guess one characteristic that I just thought of now is that it's Well, I just lost it, but I will come back to that. Oh, so one thing is related to another permanently, meaning it's not like a momentary, oh, this plate is blue, the sky is blue. It's how does this, what is, you make the observation that like he gave, I'll go with his example. He gave the example of deduction being a form of integration, because when you say all men are mortal, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. The conclusion is Socrates is mortal is an integration of the particular into the general. So he gave
Yeah.
that example, and it's a permanent integration. Of course, you're on the lookout
Yes.
for new information, but so that would, anything that's, for my crude definition is like, yeah, you make something a whole from some parts combined to form a whole, but there is some then element or characteristic of it, which is a permanent link or connection is made. I don't know how to do it better than that, which is
For
he actually said.
perception, that wouldn't work because perception is just what you're seeing. Otherwise, it'd be a memory or something non-perceptual.
Oh, you're right.
So be careful with that.
Right.
I mean, we can distinguish that there's different ways information is assembled or rearranged.
Right.
Like I wouldn't even necessarily say it's pieces put together as much as you got a set of stuff and they're rearranged or something.
Got a what? Sorry.
You just rearrangement of what you see, or
Right.
rearrangement of perception.
Right.
The way that they're put together, not that they're pieces. But anyway,
I know what you're saying,
integration,
because pieces would imply that they're already distinct
Right.
things coming at you, but there's
Right.
no, it's all simultaneous.
Right. So I mean, the permanent distinction is good for as a conceptual integration, because you could say that's uniquely what makes it not just perceptual, has been integrated as something that lasts over time, or that applies to more than the moment. So you
Right.
say integration can lead there. You
Right.
don't get that automatically percepts. You need integration to get there. You rearrange what you have or modify what you have to create an abstraction or generalization, or whatever you want to say.
Right. Okay. But would you say, if I make some kind of analogy and compare one thing that is similar to another, I'm trying to think of an example, like a recent example. What's a good example I can think of that illuminates some subject? Well, you could, okay, so an analogy might be something like philosophy is the engine of your car. And so you can drive a really nice, good looking car, but you could have a crappy engine. And so you want to work and maintain your engine to ensure that it's functioning optimally. What's on the outs, like this, the look, the appearance, the aesthetics of the car is not as important as the engine. And so philosophy, I mean, that's just whatever came to me now, but
yeah,
that's an example. Is that a form of integration?
I just the beginning of it. It's part of the process, because you're trying to find relatable comparisons. You're trying to find,
Right.
like, and if the reason for doing so is trying to reach a conclusion, you might say it's part of the way of figuring out what the relevant information there is.
Right.
Analogies would be tricky though, because you're changing the context considerably, so it's hard to say what that would be.
Right. Yeah. Okay. So
I'm not sure it would actually qualify, but I think integration would be more like you're trying to find a relationship between two things that's real. I think analogy is more of a way to explain or explore, but not really a way to integrate.
Right. Well, it is interesting. I know I'm still reading Da Vinci's biography, and he was the master of analogies. That's how he learned everything, by constantly relating completely different things to one another and then finding solutions. So, you know, like a duck's beak, a duck's face to a human face, or the wind to the water, and or I can't remember exactly what else, but he just constantly looking and observing and trying to identify random analogies of things, and that's how he learned. And so he didn't know maths, but he used shapes to help him make calculations. Right. And so I still don't know if I can see why if I say philosophy is the engine, that there's some, I don't know if it's an integration in the same sense. So
yeah, I mean, it would usually be called lateral thinking, which doesn't mean to say it's invalid, but it's not like you're reaching new discoveries or new ideas. It's just like exploring your concepts. Okay. Like say, oh, that reminds me of that. Right. And helps you recall information probably, or think of memories or things like that. But it's not the same as arriving at new conclusions. I mean, it couldn't, because it's saying, you're deliberately saying this is a completely different context. That's not even applicable, really. It's just a similarity, like association, more so.
Oh, okay. So you're maybe another characteristic. So it's good. We're getting characteristics here. So another characteristic of a conceptual integration would be you arrive at some new conclusion.
Yes.
Whereas I don't know what new conclusion I arrive at when I say philosophy is like the engine of a car.
Yeah.
And don't go beyond that. Okay. All right. And then, so obviously if I say this plate is blue, this sky is blue, that's a comparison, but there's a difference because we haven't made some permanent connection and we haven't reached there's no new conclusion yet. So maybe you're on the path to some integration, but okay.
Right. All right. That'd be one step to forming a concept, but clearly not there yet. You got to make the comparison, at least first, on your way to form the concept.
Well, actually, permanent connection is just another way of saying a new conclusion or knowledge reached.
Or long-term connection might make more sense here. Or what word would we want to use? Permanent?
Sorry?
I'm just thinking what the best word is besides permanent. I mean, new conclusion makes sense. New knowledge or conclusion.
Yeah, we'll just go with new conclusion. Okay.
I mean, knowledge would make sense because, or new conclusion resulting in new knowledge. Are they conclusions necessarily? Conclusions seem to be implying like,
well, all the examples we've gone through so far, there could be something different, but all the examples we found so far, unless there's something else you can think of, all consisted of reaching new knowledge. Whereas the examples that I gave that I was unclear on, we said they're not integration, and none of them, they made you look at things from a different perspective. Like, okay, this philosophy is like an engine, but it might make you think in a new way, but there's no permanent, or no, I don't want to use permanent. There's no conclusion that I've reached that's different than a knowledge I had before. And same with this plate is blue, this sky is blue. But at least those two examples I gave, that there's no new knowledge. There's no real new knowledge reached. There's just maybe a connection that might lead to some other connection.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm open to that this might not be it, but so far that's what we've got in the characteristics.
Right, it seems fair. The only reason I was hesitating on conclusion, because I was thinking, if you did form the concept blue, does it mean you've concluded something? I mean, you've said that this characteristic is called blue, and it shows this essential, these characteristics. But is that the same as a conclusion? Like, I mean, when you say you've concluded the concept when you formed it, I don't know if you say you've concluded it.
Well, I don't know if in that case, maybe when you form the concept color, but I don't know if then it's a matter of once you form, so forming the concept color would be some kind of I don't know. That one's trickier because it's so much closer to the perceptual level, but
Yeah.
I'm not sure. Should we go on?
Yeah.
All right. Well, you mentioned, we're
I'll
talking
just
about,
clarify one thing. Like
yes.
you reached a new mental entity because Rand is claiming that there's an entity, the concept is part of conceptual integration, that the result is a concept. It's distinct from just saying it's knowledge, which might be, well, you could integrate not things into ideas, into propositions. So actually, never mind about that. You could do that.
Yeah. What about, and concepts into propositions and principles, right?
Yeah, you would need to recognize that when are you integrating into a concept or are you integrating into a proposition?
Right.
That might be a little distinction.
Yes.
And by being conceptual, they're long range or permanent, you could say.
Beyond the range of the moment.
Yeah.
Okay. This is actually from Opar, but he spoke about it again and added an extra example. So on the topic of context dropping, do you remember in Opar he writes about Chamberlain, how Chamberlain appeased Hitler and he dropped the context of political history, philosophy, dictators in history. And then he gave another example, which was a letter written about free will. And the person made the argument that Kant shouldn't be blamed for all the evil in the world. People chose to accept Kant's ideas and people have free will, so they're responsible. That's a super condensed version of his letter, not Kant. And so he gave that as an example of context dropping and he mentioned that, free will has a certain identity. There's a division of labor and there's a division of cognitive labor as well. And, if everyone was terrible in the profession of being a doctor and you got some disease, you can't just say, well, I had free will, but I got a disease, so it's my fault. And so my question about that is in terms of so context dropping is active. And I think we've spoken about this, whereas there's also ignorance. Like today, I don't know, maybe back then when Chamberlain was the prime minister of the UK or Britain, it was different. But today, I don't know if people, you can't really tell if it's context dropping, which is active, or just plain ignorance. Like the process of connecting and integrating is non-obvious to me. It's almost a case of the subconscious will alert you to relevant subjects unless you do a lot of research and observation and spend your life studying one particular thing. Your subconscious is alerting you to relevant considerations, and either you have them and then you think about them, and then you choose to drop them, or you just don't, and you don't even know that something else is relevant, which I think is probably the case. What do you think? Like today, for example, politicians, are they really dropping context, or are they just not integrative at all?
It's hard to say sometimes.
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking in terms, I mean, you're right that sometimes it could be ignorance that you don't know something. Did Chamberlain not know about that history, or did he ignore it?
Well, it's
At some level,
not just not know, but not even know. Like you can know it, but not even know it's going to help now. You might think like, well, yeah, that happened in the past, but now we've got things are different. I don't know, things are different, to take that philosophical line. So it's hard to tell if it's even a case of like maybe he didn't know any history, maybe he did, but he just didn't know it would be relevant. Like he didn't think it would be relevant. There's a lot of ignorance, a possibility for ignorance.
well, as far as judging people, the hard part is how do you know which it is? I mean, how do you know that they're not just being incompetent versus evil? I mean, they can resemble each other sometimes.
Right.
If you're just not good at your job, doesn't mean you're doing something bad on purpose. It just means you don't know enough to handle it. You're not able to deal with the problems that crop up.
Right.
You could say that was Chamberlain. Was he just terrible at his job? Maybe. I think context given his position, the context of where he was hired and all that, it seems like he was just evading. But that would depend on the historical research you do. You can't just out of hand say, oh, it must have been some evil event hidden or some context dropping.
Right.
But if you know enough about that event, you might be able to reach a good, clear conclusion.
Right.
You're right. Sometimes it would just be ignorance. That's what I would mean by incompetence. Maybe they just didn't get the right education. But then you need to judge, are they avoiding learning because they want this ignorance? Are they avoiding learning such that they're unable to have any context to judge? I mean, maybe there's a mental laziness going on there, even if it's not context dropping per se. But I think the more important point is, even if all those things are true, or even if it was just incompetence, but the whole idea of, yeah, people could accept Kant's ideas or reject them, or even accept them implicitly without realizing it was the originator of it. But we don't say, oh, it's just Kant is irrelevant now. People make their own decisions. Well, Kant is responsible to some degree in creating this idea for people to accept, introducing them to it, then offering it. Like, to some extent, he's guilty to the extent that he's promoting a way of thinking that's harmful and negative and bad. And to that extent, he's to blame, of course. It's not the same blame as, say, the person who commits a crime. It's not like somebody commits a murder in the name of Kant. If that ever happened, you don't say, oh, that person's innocent. It's all Kant's fault. Well, Kant a little bit, but it's the person's fault for doing it, like more so than Kant. But I guess you could argue about, in the grand scheme of things, what did Kant cause to occur?
Right.
From a distance versus what are people committing now? It would be dropping context in a way to say, like, obviously Kant can't murder anybody today, obviously. But it doesn't mean his ideas have no impact. Right. Same with Hitler even, or Nazis, or any particular idea you can think of. Or the Spanish Inquisition, like, it doesn't, like, whatever things come up, maybe the effects linger on, maybe they don't.
One of the reasons I put in the example of the free will letter from the lecture, because before I started studying with you, I don't think I had I didn't give much thought to the free will. I didn't really get it, but I wouldn't have thought, oh yeah, of course, free will has an identity. Like there's a certain amount of information I can process and learn within a certain amount of time. The philosophical ideas are abstract. They're not instantly understood. Like, I don't know if I necessarily would have instantly started thinking about that. Whereas only after I studied philosophy, I did. That was why I put it in there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And okay, so integration. So he actually said in this lecture, there's no explicit theory. I think he said of integration, but I mean, maybe he meant of induction. I think he meant of induction. And so other than just giving observations and tons of examples, you can't, he could really explain, well, how much do you integrate? Where do you look? What do you do when you're integrating? It's more, no, he couldn't do it in the abstract. He had to give heaps of examples.
Yeah.
And it seems like when it comes to this, we are still in the area, like so pre-logic, when we tried to come up with an argument, it was just kind of be alert and a bit of chance. It seems like it's the same here. It's try and ask your subconscious for things that things that are relevant and hope it alerts you to the right things. Basically, seems to be the way. Look at how other people integrate, and then notice what they observe, and then try to copy and hope that your subconscious also alerts you to the right things. That seems to be, if I've understood it correctly, that seems to be how it's done here too. Because we don't have an explicit theory, so it's like pre-logic.
I think that's fair to say. I think a lot of that's psychology too. That's the answer partly. But yeah, I mean, it's not, he doesn't have that theory. He can't offer it to you because it doesn't have it yet.
Right. He talks about reduction, as I mentioned this to you before, but he goes into this in more detail now. So reduction isn't sufficient Like it's necessary, but it's not sufficient to validate an idea. He says you need to horizontally integrate. He calls that a vital check. Now,
Yeah.
one reason why he says you need to horizontally integrate is that it determines, we can say contextualizes an idea. He says determines the interpretation and use of the proven idea, which I understand that because the example he gives is in honesty. You know, if you only reduced honesty without observing or trying to analyze its relationship to other virtues, you might,
Yeah.
you could reasonably say something like, well, honesty is not creating an alternative. Honesty is corresponding to reality, and I'm hungry, so let me steal this food off you. Or if someone invents an airplane, you're like, well, they're liars because they're not corresponding to reality. They've created an alternative reality. You gave those examples,
Yes.
which I thought were great. Which makes sense. So you need it to contextualize. Like it's not enough just to reduce an idea. You need it to you need to contextualize it with the rest
Yeah.
of your knowledge.
Yeah.
But he says you can't be completely certain. So another reason he says is that you can't be completely certain that your proof is valid until you perform the relevant horizontal integrations. And he does actually give examples. So he gives examples of, I don't know if you know these, I didn't understand them at all, but Parmenides saying there's no change, Heraclitus saying there's all change. And they both did reductions, but they
Yep.
didn't do horizontal integration. So apparently they were still wrong. But I was like, well, okay, where can I go wrong if I reduce an animal to a dog? I do see the need to horizontally integrate to contextualize ideas and ensure you apply them properly. But in the actual process of reduction itself, where could I possibly go wrong in terms of just validating that the proof is valid unless I'm, yeah.
It makes me think of the chickens are bipeds definition. Like if you just reduce chicken as by that definition, sure it'll work. You can
Oh,
reduce it to the
okay.
chicken. But
Okay.
then if you horizontally integrate, you take into account other things that are not just a reduction of the same thing. You'll say man fits the definition, or penguins,
Could you say
or
that again? Man is the definition. What?
man would fit that definition. Featherless biped.
Okay.
You
Got
could
it.
say man does. We could say what else does. That's about it.
Got it.
Or like if you, or just saying biped was what defined chicken. Any biped is a
Cool.
chicken. Little
Okay.
man's a biped. An ostrich is a biped. Like is an ostrich a chicken? Things like that.
Right. That makes sense. So basically because concepts are formed in a context, in a sense, they're not valid unless they're looked at in that context. Because you can, I still need to get my head around that. I get what you're saying. It's like you can come up with some definition. Basically, you can come up with a non-essential definition for something, and since you're not relating it to anything else, whatever non-essential definition you come up with works.
Yeah. Or it could be related to like when furniture needs the concept habitation alongside it. Like you could maybe define it without habitation, but you'd have many issues if you didn't. It helps to horizontally integrate to consider other relevant factors or things that create something for the context. Like habitation determines something about the proper definition of, say, furniture.
And at least the claim from Ito, which we will get to, is still that definitions are what are essential. They determine the validity of propositions. So
yeah, the essentials of the concepts.
Right. And then so you could take that and even think in terms of, okay, well, if you don't even, okay, you can go, there are examples that you've just given of you go wrong if you don't horizontally integrate with forming concepts, like you accept all chickens are bipeds. And so you can just imagine how that might multiply when you're not horizontally integrating a propositional argument used as an axiom or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, so okay, this was, the next one was just me going, we discussed that subconscious is the signal for what to integrate.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is where I thought it got interesting. He later talked on, or even more interesting actually, he talked about how it's very important to always be on the lookout for hierarchy and get a feel for the relative levels, the different levels of hierarchy for different ideas. So for example, okay, no, I didn't use an example. So where on the hierarchy these things are, and then if two concepts, two propositions or principles are on completely different levels of hierarchy, they throw out the whole argument. Now that bit I was, okay, that's interesting. I understand this of the level, we touched on this on the level, like I can't compare a dog to an animal, for example, and they're on different levels of the hierarchy. I can compare a dog to a lizard or a dog to a goat, but I can't compare a dog to animal. And then he used an example here, which to give an example of how this is true, that the hierarchy, you always need to be on the lookout for hierarchy. So here's the argument. A man on a desert island cannot get as much knowledge as he could in society. And therefore, this is me breaking it down. Therefore, man has two means of knowledge, reason and other people. And he says this is an example of how you go wrong when you combine two things on completely different levels of the hierarchy. Do you see it, by the way, before I go on and give the...
I think so.
Okay, well,
I think I know what he's talking. Depends.
I'll give the answer.
Sure.
Because even with the answer, I didn't see.
Yeah.
I was... Okay, so one is reason is the foundation of all thought. That's low on the hierarchy. Division of labor is productive and efficient. That's high on the hierarchy.
Yeah.
And so he's saying the issue with this argument is that it violates the principle of the hierarchical structure of knowledge. Now, I get if you argue from, okay, reason, you need reason to validate all knowledge from other people, knowledge from nature. And so, yes, you can gain more in society, but it doesn't mean you have two means of knowledge. But then he's saying, I get it when you discuss it on that level, but when you start saying it violates the principle of the hierarchical structure of knowledge, I'm quite confused how, okay, here's the two ideas. I can see they're on different levels of the hierarchy, how that relates to doing a comparison between, say, animal and dog, and how that destroys the argument. I mean, I'm not fully following.
Oh.
Like I could see here, given what he's pointed out, I can see some of it. But now if you give me any other argument where this pattern is followed, I don't know if I'd be able to get that.
My first thought is that using other people or using reason, that using people is just a subcategory of using reason. It's just lower in the hierarchy. As in, either way you're using reason, but right. Using other people is just one application of reason. That's how I see it. So you couldn't make arguments about the two things existing when reason is the genesis of thinking with two other people.
Right. Okay. And then how does, okay, so I'm just trying to work out like what is the mechanics of when you're combining two, because I still would struggle to look out for something in those terms of, oh, okay, this violates the principle of the hierarchical structure of knowledge. Like how is he combining them incorrectly here? So man has two means of knowledge, reason and other people, and you got that from, you gain more knowledge in society than you do on a desert island. So where is the, I don't know if you can simplify this anymore, but
I think it might arise in situations like where somebody's making an assertion that there's two types of something or so many types of somethings. You might be on the lookout for which way they're organized, in particular then, especially because they're listing, like, say, oh, there's three means of integration, and somebody says what they are, you would want to look at first if what the hierarchy is, and you wouldn't just straight go to looking at just analyzing if they're correct first. You'd go to the hierarchy, see how those relate. Are they really different types of something? Are they different kinds of something, or is one subsumed by the other?
Yeah.
Because that's a very easy error to catch early.
What do you mean that's an easy error to catch early?
Well, if they're early in the sense that it's right there in the words they pick, you don't have to go into their argument to really see that there's an error at that point.
Okay.
It's just like the first stage of evaluating an argument in a way. Look at the way the concepts are arranged, their hierarchy, things like that.
Right. I'd need to think about this one. He does, what you're saying ties in with what he said, which is like people taking everything and putting it on the table in front of them and then arranging it.
Yep.
As if it's all on one level. But I'd need to get used to picking that out. And I'd probably need more examples to be able to start picking that out.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see what else. Yeah, I mean, he gave also the example of religion, someone comparing religion to socialism. And this was a real thing. When, like, a student tried to wrote a list of characteristics of religion and socialism and try to compare them.
That's a good one. Yeah.
Yeah, and then so that was it. He gave that as another example. Like, you can't. Yeah, so I wrote it here. He's relating two positions, and you can't list side by side and get any connection between them because they're on completely different hierarchical levels. But see, I don't know if I get it now that he explained it, but I see there's way more here because I don't know if I would have thought about that.
Yeah. I don't know where I got the idea either. I must have got it from Peikoff. I don't remember this, but it sounds like what I'm saying is what he's saying. I must have got it from him. What I'm thinking about this.
Yeah.
Must have been.
Yeah. So, but yeah, I guess we can keep this in mind. And as arguments or discussions come up, we can try and like from other philosophers or something, we can try to think in those terms of like, is this break it down that way? I wouldn't have been able to, like, I really like how he somehow managed to identify, okay, division of labor is productive and efficient. Reason is the foundation of all thought, as some kind of like principles combined in that argument, but on completely different levels of hierarchy. Okay, so I think
this is lecture 1 of Art of
lecture
Thinking?
lecture two, integration. Lecture 1 was, I would say, disintegration. This one is integration.
Yeah.
Okay. We can go to some Ito.
Sure.
Yeah, so this idea of, so this is truth is the product of the recognition, identification of facts of reality. It does that by means of concepts, and concepts are retained by means of definitions. So this is actually cool because it's somewhat relevant. Okay, so I think I vaguely remember we sort of talked about this ages ago, and I was confused by it, and I'm still confused by it, but the truth, we'll try again and we can move on if it's not clear. So in the book, she says, or in her lectures, she says, the truth or falsehood of his propositions rest not only on their relation to the facts he asserts, but also on the truth or falsehood of the definitions of the concepts he uses to asserts them, which in turn rests on the truth or falsehood of designating essential characteristics. Now, how, like, why is it, I can see how, okay, so if you want something truthful, then the proposition needs to correspond to the facts. But then why is the definition, like, how does the proposition become false if the definitions are not designating essential characteristics? That's what, like, if I say, okay, some men are mean, that's a proposition. And let's say in my mind, the defining characteristics of man is a thumb having animal.
Yeah.
So but I've said some men are mean, and that's my observation, and it corresponds to truth in a sense. This is my simplistic understanding. So maybe I'm completely off here, but I don't really understand why. I can see how it helps thinking, like if you have the right definition, but I don't really see why it's so important that it determines the truth or falsehood of the proposition itself.
So I'm thinking this in terms of, say when you say some men are mean, is your proposition,
Yes.
and then your definition is thumb having animal. We could say that when you say by nature, some men are mean, we could say that the nature of having thumbs relates to their being mean. Like in a way, whether that's true that men are mean, some men are mean, depends on in what way you're talking about man. What way are you referring to him? Like in what about man are you talking about him? In a way you're talking about certain features about that are relevant to being mean or the identity of whatever concept that whatever proposition it is. It depends on the way you've conceptualized each piece of it, what you're even talking about in the first place. When you say man, what are you referring to? You might be referring to something else than what somebody's saying. Like, trying to think of this better. Like, two people conceptualize it different entirely, whether or not it's true that some men are mean depends on what characteristics you think are relevant to judging who is a man, which concretes am I looking at? What am I looking at to say that they are mean? I think that's the best I can say for it.
Okay. So let me think.
Like I would think that saying some men are mean, you would be saying that there's something about having thumbs that makes some men mean. To me, that seems like what you'd probably be saying, which wouldn't make sense.
But
What
that
does
would
having
be,
thumbs?
I don't think so, because that would be equating the definition with the concept, which
Yeah,
we're told not to do, right?
right.
So
So
just because it's a non-essential doesn't mean you don't hold other characteristics. They're just
right.
not occurring to you.
Yeah.
So I guess,
That's
yes,
true.
there's a situation where I can define something. There's like a mismatch in definitions. Like someone is referring to one thing, another person is referring to another, although that's pretty rare unless it's very
Yeah.
abstract, like freedom.
Yeah.
But yeah, in the case of, yeah, anyway, I don't, like, what would be a false definition of something? Even if I, if I defined man as car, but I actually meant man. And if I define car as man, like the only trouble I'd have is simply in communicating with other people. But
Yes.
that's not an issue. Okay. So that's naming. Actually, I don't think that's not naming. That's the word. That's not the concept.
Right.
But I'm not sure what is a. So like, how can you have a false definition that's? Could you have a false definition that's still based on an essential?
I don't know if you can.
Because if you can't, then what's being said here is simply the truth or falsehood of the proposition rests on the essential, the designating essential characteristics in the definition. That's it, right? Like there's no other option. So if your definition is true, you're designating essential characteristics. If it's false, you're not. So it all comes down to designation of essential characteristics, if I've understood this correctly.
Yeah. That sounds right.
Yeah, okay. So So then, yeah, that's I'm still lost in terms of like, if we don't confuse, and I don't know if a lot of people do this, but yeah, if you don't confuse the definition with the concept, then what is trying to be conveyed in this thing when they're saying, like all the truth and falsehood of the proposition itself rests on designating essential characteristics.
And to me, it just would say that it's harder to know the truth or falsehood of a proposition if it's not based on essentials. How would you even judge it? It would be really messy. It'd be almost subjective. You couldn't really even decide. That's what I
Right.
would think. Not that
Right.
not that you can't say something that is true. Whether you know it's true, it's different. You could say something that is true, but I guess the problem is, do they mean what they say, or are they merely repeating it?
Right.
Like if you just say a true proposition and you don't know why, nothing to do with knowing anything, it's just stated correctly by chance, then I don't know if you'd call that a true proposition. But I don't know what she's really trying to say, other than it's messier, less organized, and less effective if your definitions are poor or weak.
Maybe she means, I was just thinking now, maybe she's only referring to very abstract concepts like freedom.
I would bet that that sounds right, but this is a bit confusing what she means
Yeah.
here, I think. I probably would
Yeah.
need to look at the appendix to look at it better.
Yeah. The reason I was thinking about this was like, well, how many people have actually properly defined words? That means everything they say is false, but clearly that's also not true. So there's something, I don't think this is wrong. I'm not getting it. And there's something here. Yeah. So anyway, that was. Okay, I'm just reading this section. Okay. Yeah. So this idea that every concept stands for a number of propositions, does that just mean all the observations you've made? If you want to explain that what the concept actually is, there are just heaps of, I guess, explanations, is the word, will come up in your mind. And those explanations are in the form of propositions. Like, okay, a monkey is this thing and it moves around and it screams and it eats bananas. Like all those are propositions, right? And so that's what it means, is that there's all these observations and they all stand for the observations themselves can be explained through propositions, and that's how you get a concept. So every concept, just you could, it's like what is it, that a picture is worth 1,000 words. In this case,
Yes.
a word is worth 1,000 propositions.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, it includes horizontal integrations too, just all the relevant information, like what you would do if you're writing a book on integration. Basically, your definition would be that book. Like you don't write it all down, obviously, but if you were to write a book, that's what it's condensed.
Right. Could you repeat that? If you're writing a book on,
like, I'll put it this way: if say you got the definition for integration, if you were to say what those observations were that made up that concept and what other concepts you've had, you'd practically write a book. Like every discussion we've had or every argument you've had in your head, you've condensed that into a definition. But if you open it up, there'd be lots of arguments and other concepts in there.
Got it. Yeah, I understand. Let's see. Okay, so Well, I mean, I guess this makes it not clear, but this quote that I copied out does make me think more about this idea of designating essential characteristics. So if a concept does stand for pages and pages of propositions, and you identify that thing which grabs as much information as possible in a condensed way, then if you don't do that, actually, I'm not sure, to be honest. So
Well, you'd be overwhelmed if you didn't condense it, of course.
right. All right, just one last thing and we can wrap up here. So this is just so here she talks about proposed definition. She's writing about an anthropologist writing in a national magazine. He suggests that man's essential distinction from all other animals' essential characteristics is the achievement of possessing a thumb. What about man's other type of consciousness? Wait, what about man's type of consciousness? Blank out. And she gives all these examples, like language, having animal, and then she's like, blank out, blank out. It's for dramatic effect, I know that, but like,
Yeah.
what do you think about when she does that? Maybe some of these things, to me at least, like once she points them out, I'm like, oh yeah, okay, I see. But I don't know if I'm honest, I don't know if I'd be able to, if you asked me without having read any philosophy and I was just, I don't know, I went to university and studied anthropology, I don't know if I'd be able to even know if it's, I wouldn't think in these terms. I don't know if I'd necessarily notice at all. So.
Yeah, I don't like the term blank out. Like it seems like they
The
would have
context-
responses, I'm
right.
sure.
It's
And then
also
you could
going
argue
to,
with them.
right. It's going to that context dropping thing that I talked about with Neville Chamberlain too, which is,
Yeah.
you know, like, is it context dropping or is it simply ignorance?